All right, guys. So our second to last topic on ethics is going to be about inequality. So what we're going to do is we're going to explain what equality is. So the first thing you need to do in your hyperdoc is actually explain what it is, right? Identify the origins of inequality. So I'm going to go over that. We're going to think about what inequality looks like in New Zealand, and then we're going to look at some possible solutions to inequality. So there's quite a big gap between the rich and the poor. So in 2017, a study from Oxfam found that the eight richest people in the world have as much money as the poorest half of the rest of the global population. So eight people has had as much money as 3.6 billion people. The 10 most wealthy companies in the world have a revenue greater than that of 180 countries in the world combined. So although these countries are considered poor, right, that's still pretty crazy. And around 10% of the global population live on less than $20 a week New Zealand money. So why are some people rich and some people poor? So we can look at history. So former colonies, that's wealth was exploited and plundered. Weak and corrupt government leads to further exploitation of the poor. So if you look at a country like Nigeria and Uganda, or pick a country in Africa, it's rife over there. A lack of economic investment. So when you have a country that is poor and has a lot of conflict, also people don't want to invest there because it's too risky. So think you don't really want to build your businesses in a place where people might be stealing your goods or all that jazz. Political violence, war, or lawlessness. So the cycle of trauma, right? So violence breeds poverty, and poverty breeds more violence, and countries get stuck in it, just as people do as well. So what you're going to do is you're going to watch a video on the Hyperdoc that talks about what are tax havens. So you'll be able to explain how do tax havens help people stay poor, or countries stay poor, I should say. And I think this is probably one of the biggest issues as to why countries end up poor, because rich people hoard their money offshore. Why are some people rich and some people poor? So national debt, so money we've borrowed from other countries, so money that could be used in national investment and to alleviate poverty is instead used to pay back money for loans from rich countries. So China is usually one that lends out a lot of the money to people, and people end up having to pay back debt rather than put money into helping poor people. Another one is susceptibility to natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, or tsunamis. So New Zealand is counted in this, right? So, for example, the cost of cleaning up after one earthquake and tsunami cost the Solomon Islands, which is a relatively poor country, right? They're quite small, but it cost them 95% of their national budget. So almost all their money got spent just cleaning up from one disaster, right? So you can see why they end up staying poor. But in New Zealand, we don't have many of these problems, okay? We don't really have war, at least not in New Zealand, right? We usually send like a few hundred soldiers overseas. We're a rich former colony, so we weren't screwed over too much by our colonizers, mostly because they ended up living here. Us, well, Pākehā being the descendant of these colonizers, right? Stable and one of the least corrupt governments. So New Zealand actually has one of the best governments in the world in terms of they're not stealing your money and hiding it away so they can have pool parties and whatnot. New Zealand is relatively rich. So although we are susceptible to natural disasters, we are often wealthy enough to absorb the cost with little damage. So think of the Christchurch earthquakes, right? And even the poorest in New Zealand are relatively well off due to our welfare system. So they get around $200 a week on the benefit versus $20 that the rest of the world seems to live on. But New Zealand technically has a high level of inequality, because inequality is the difference between the rich and the poor, right? So 1/5 of New Zealand's wealth is owned by the richest 1% of the population. So around 40% of the people have 20% of the money. And the poorest may only get $200 a week, while the richest has a net worth of over $11 billion, which is quite a lot of cha-ching. So some philosophical questions around this. So why has the equality risen? Can such inequality be justified? And why should one person be so rich and the other so poor? Is there such a thing as deserving wealth? And how should wealth be distributed in a just and fair society? So most societies believe in your right to own something called property rights, and that your own property should be protected, and that if someone breaks your right to own property, that there is a criminal system to deal with the perpetrator accordingly. So if someone steals your car, you expect them to be punished for stealing your car. It was your property to begin with, right? However, your right to own a property is not absolute. So we pay land tax and get branded criminals if we don't pay it. So they're called rates. And some people consider taking rates without consent or taxing without consent as being the same as theft. So more